Hi fashion historians. I'm really excited today to be able to show you some different garments. These are going to be from the 1920s to the 1930s, early swimwear. Now many of you have taken textiles, but most of you know that just because you wear wool, that it can be a little bit uncomfortable in a swimsuit compared to wearing the modern Lycra fabrics that we have today. So what's really going to be interesting about what I'm going to show you is not only the fabric that swimwear was originally made from, but also the styling. So let's take a look. We're going to start out with the early 1920s. And this particular bathing costume, as they were called in that time, this is a male bathing costume. Covered the chest area and a little pair of shorts under his long tank top. And right here where you can't see are some belt loops. And this would have been worn with a belt. Belts are very popular for menswear starting in the 1920s, especially coming out of World War I, where military wore belts instead of the suspender braces. We see that this being added functionally as a statement of fashion, wearing a modern belt, but also the fact that wool, when it's saturated with water, can stretch. And so if you can imagine this thing stretching down to your knees, the belt would definitely help this stay up at your waistline. Now there are a tremendous amount of I don't know if we can get a close-up here of moth holes. These are, almost they're 100 years old, or almost 100 years old, and not stored in airtight containers. So over the years, moths have had a good feast on some of these pieces I'm going to show you. But at least you can see the styling of that time. There's two things I'd like to point out about this, one being the textile product that we're using. Synthetic spandex to add stretch to everything that we're wearing during this pandemic has not been invented and won't be invented for another 45, 50 years. So we're seeing natural fibers used, wool being a very predominant fabric used in sporting costumes. Designers just translated it to swimming. Water is resisted by wool for a certain amount of time. But if you're completely submerged for 5 minutes, it is then going to become oversaturated and then become like a boat anchor. But one of the things on this, I want you to note the color. And those of you, when we look at fashion colors today, they're very vivid and very bright. We often think of people that lived before us as not having access to these wonderful teal colors in this case. So it is really, I want to point out that this is something that you're going to see. I've got some great fashion colors that are in today that were also available in the 1920s. And lastly, this is a knit. So this garment, although you can't touch and feel, it is made in a knitwear process. So this is going to give you some stretch. So this bathing costume was great when you might play with a ball on the beach, but if you moved into the water, no matter what it was made of, as long as it was wool, it was going to get very heavy and would eventually, drop down to about your knees. So that belt's really good. It's going to hold it up. So that's a male costume. We'll take a look at a few more over here. They're very fun, not particularly, stored well, and you can see how they've tried to patch them here, but they do give us an idea of what was worn and how much of the body was covered. Another male costume here, giving full coverage to cover both chest and back, and a little bit of short on the bottom there. Again, look at these beautiful, vivid colors. This one paired not with solid color, but with some striping that is knitted in this horizontal position. And it has turned a little bit of a cream color. So at one time it was probably white, and just the aging process does turn it this kind of ivory color. Another male bathing costume. This is a two-piece. So here we have a complete tank top along with the trunks that a man could wear. And again, this has belt loops, so we can hold them up. The shirt was meant to be worn over. That was the style at that time. So completely covered, a canvas belt, probably the belt of choice. You can see this coloration with a heather navy wool and this kind of goldenrod color or marigold color. Again, some high fashion colors for the 1920s. If you think of some of the Ringling Brothers circus, the man with the barbells, the weightlifter, here's a great costume, kind of reminiscent of that. In the 1990s through 2005, Gucci was one of the largest sellers of swimwear, and part of it was because they started putting these kind of keyhole circles in different places on the body. Probably in that time period, they might have been a little risque compared to the 1920s where it appears under the arm. But really, we look at Gucci and we say, where did they get that styling from? Did they invent it? No, somebody did it long before. And back here in the 1920s, we actually had a lot of cutouts just to give design detail to swimwear. A one piece, being the tank top, is attached to the trunk underneath, but very much gives that kind of 1920s, 1930s barbell lifting outfit, but intended for swimwear. Although I've been told that wrestling costume for colleges and high schools at that time were very similar and created out of wool. Wool was the fabric of choice because cotton stretches, but it doesn't stretch back. And we all know that when we get baggy butt in our jeans. But here, the wool, after it dries, will spring back. And so that was why wool was the fabric of choice. Costume here that I would like to hold up, and again they felt that this with the shorter trunk underneath and the longer skirt was perhaps female. Females were wearing bathing costumes at this time. As we get into the latter 20s, we think of this as a young woman's bathing costume. If you were grandma, you were still literally wearing a cotton fabric dress that might even have an apron on the front, a little bit shorter with some pantaloons, and you would be on the beach in that. Where younger youth of the time in the 1920s, especially in America, were choosing these rather risque costume. But think of the flapper and think of the exposing even the knees and the arms, not wearing a corset. So you could see that times had changed, and this would have been a costume for definitely youth. I want to point out here this vivid color. Again, made out of wool, and again, that is the fabric of choice based on the resiliency of wool, but the fact that it dyes these beautiful colors. So the combination of lime green, purple, and black, people don't readily think of the 1920s having this kind of color variation, and this was very fashionable, the combination of the use of this lime or shamrock green, it was sometimes called. And then lastly, in this early to mid 1920s, I'm going to pull up another one with very high color, and this being, again, they rather female, although the skirt is shorter, so sometimes in that case, we think it's more of a top, but because the trunks underneath are much shorter, that too, it kind of led them to believe this was a female costume. But also the color, just like in the case of our lime green, this beautiful kind of Maasai or cardinal red might be indicative of a female costume. I want to point out here we've got a lot of repair in the crotch area. We talk often about why undergarments don't last through the centuries, and why for many, many centuries we think that females did not wear undergarments. And it is because very few of them survive. This costume being 100 years old, you can see there's a lot of repairs there under the arms, in the front area, not just from moths, but from bodily fluids, from perspiration. That degrades our natural fibers so much that really, if this were, stored in somebody's cupboard, it may not even last this well. This we've been storing for many years in acid-free paper so that we can keep what we have. So that shows kind of a reason that, fabrics that are not stored properly are going to degrade. Let's jump into the late 1920s, really going into the time about 1935, and we are going to see some kind of transition in the fashion as more and more people, more and more youth after World War I are, coming into sporting activities, college, all of these activities that lead to the need for sporting costumes. This is kind of that transition, again, a barbell look, but we actually, even in our textbook, have some pictures of that late 1920s going into the 1930s of both male and female starting to wear a shorter costume. With these that have the legs on them, again, they're going to pull us down into the water once they are saturated, and that we start to see the legs start to trim up, so we have less fabric on us, but enough to cover the body. Again, if you go to Vogue magazine from 2000, you literally can go in, if it's a summer issue, and you can look at swimwear that looks almost exactly like this, done in a white or ivory lycra with this same shape. And today the mallet, or one-piece mallet as we call it, really takes on this shape. As we get into the 1930s, we're transitioning, and these actually are female costumes. And we can tell because men at this time are actually wearing bathing costumes without a shirt. So that's an interesting part. They decided they're going to swim and not sink, and so we see the male costume becoming a one-piece trunk, where the female costume then has both front breast coverage and then full body below the torso. We have two little anchors here that give us that nautical feel, and this actually has a label in it. We start labeling. I've got several that have labels of Catalina and Janssen, two big sportswear companies that lasted well into the 21st century. But today, Catalina is owned by Walmart, so you can see how labels can change in modern retailing. But definitely old swimwear companies that lasted for 50, 60 years, made here in Los Angeles and Massachusetts, and kept our American swimmers in the proper fashionable swimwear. So here you can see this is very much shortened in the leg, the little tank or blouson top coming over that. There are belt loops here that, again, a canvas belt would have held this up so that if it got wet, it didn't end up shrinking, or not shrinking, completely flowing down to your knees. Full coverage there. And very much a nautical French blue. In that same time period, here we see a Janssen swim costume, very sleek and modern for the time, but also a body that could be worn today. And we do see some of this swimwear, and we see it coming back for one-piece swimwear in everything from a 00 to plus sizing. As we get into the late 1930s, we really see the bathing suit taking on a truly modern form that we carry through to today. Now, we won't see the bikini until the 1950s, but definitely we have that one piece that looks very much like we would see today. Here we have this halter top, so very bare on the back. For those, and again, we're suntanning at this time. From the 1920s on, we start to see that tan skin is really a sign that you are able to do sporting events. 20 years before that, during our late Victorians and our Edwardians, we have everyone carrying a parasol so that they don't have a tan. So we start to see even adornment and beauty start to change. And lastly, we're going to close out the 1930s with a bathing suit here. Again, this one is actually a wool and cotton mix. It is by Janssen Sport, so an American company making ready-made suits for the world. And it's got the little swimmer here on this edge, and I want to kind of hold that up because we still will see the Janssen label with our swimmer on that. This one has a little bit of bodice detailing to give shape. Again, when you are, these do not have any cups or anything inside like modern suits do, but it definitely, these, even just the detailing lines would add shape, and there are ties here that can tie that a little bit tighter around the body itself to hold this up, because we still have a wool component that would allow it to elongate when it's wet. One of the things we know about wool is that it will shrink. And if it's agitated in moisture and heat, perhaps the heat of the day, swimming in the water, agitating this, moving around, could cause the felting process. And so felting, as those of you that have been in textiles, you know that this can cause it to shrink. And so that was one of the details that they had to pay attention to in wearing a bathing costume. Would it shrink or felt when they went to dry it after a day at the beach? So lots of things to think about, and also to think about our modern clothing today. Our synthetic fibers have been invented to keep what nature gave us, but go beyond that and make them more easy care, or in the case of Lycra, make them more wearable for today's fashions. So there you have it.